Hello everyone, Katie again from the Museum of Ontario Archaeology. This afternoon we're going to be looking at some artifacts. So I have a whole bunch of artifacts that I have with me here that are all from a sort of a founding collection of the museum, or the collection that the museum started with, essentially, which is called the Jury Collection. A local archaeologist in the 1920s through to about the 1950s was collecting artifacts. I should define artifacts. Artifacts are things that have been left in the ground that are physical things that you can touch and that we find today. Wilfred Jury was collecting all of these artifacts and amassing them into a much larger collection from all farmers, or many farmers, that were around Southwestern Ontario, around London where he lived, or near London where he lived, and we have these all today. What's a little bit different about these artifacts compared to artifacts that are being excavated now or more recently is that there's very little information for where the artifacts were from specifically. There's no archaeological records for them whatsoever, or very little. And that means that we don't know what artifacts they were found with, where they were found, how they were found. Most of them probably come from farmers picking them out of their fields when they plow, which is how we find a lot of our archaeological sites today. So what we can say about them from an archaeological standpoint is very little, but they do represent similar types of artifacts that we find frequently here in Southwestern Ontario. The artifacts that I have here today are all Indigenous artifacts from approximately 1500 AD or CE, so about 500 years old. A couple more hundred, say 500 to 700, is probably very close to the range for all of these. I'm going to talk a little bit later on next week about seriation, which is how we put things into timelines, or a way we put things into timelines, and context, which is what these artifacts are lacking most often. So we'll talk more about those then. But for today, we're just going to talk about the artifacts themselves. And again, I have learned from this morning's kids video about the comments, and I'm making sure I can see them on my computer. Hopefully they'll come up on my camera as well, but I will be able to see them. There we go. So if you do have a question, ask, and I will be happy to answer as we go along. First artifact that I'm going to talk about, now I should say, as I said, none of these come from the Lawson site, which is the museum, or which is the archaeological site that is associated with the museum, that's adjacent to the building, and that Heather was talking about yesterday in the video from yesterday afternoon. So these are not from that site, but many of these are very similar to the types of artifacts that we would find there. So first thing we're going to look at is a large rock. It has an indent there, and on this one it has it on both sides, and a smaller rock. These are always very round. This is a grinding stone and a grinder. Some other terms for them are a mano and a metati, which comes from the Latin. So this is held in the hand. Latin for hand is manus. Mano is the term. And you can also refer to them as a mortar and a pestle, and they all work exactly the same way. So our more modern mortar and pestles that we might have in our kitchens today for grinding up spices and for grinding up nuts and things like that are not that dissimilar to these here. So we would put different herbs, charcoal, berries, anything that we want to grind up would be ground in the small hole here, or actually the grinding would form that dent over time. Now these are very small and they come in a wide variety of sizes. They can be about this size, this is as small as they get, up to very large, 2 feet across stones, and big heavy stones for grinding up much larger quantities of things. So corn, maize would be ground on a much larger grinding stone and grinder in the village when they were farming. And these would be used for those smaller amounts. We find them at all sizes in between as well. Nearby the museum, just a little bit to the north, is the little town of Arva, and they have a stone ground flour mill. And that stone ground flour process is basically exactly the same. Instead of human power, it's water powered, that particular mill. And it all works on exactly the same principle. Stones grinding flour and foods down into a usable grain. The next thing that we're going to look at, and please feel free, as I said, to pipe in with any questions. I will see them, and they are coming up now. I can absolutely see them, and I will answer them for you if I can. So the next thing we're going to look at looks like this here. Has a nice edge right here, and this is an axe head. Axes were made of stone prior to metal here in Southern Ontario. Indigenous populations here in Southern Ontario, prior to Europeans bringing metals bringing metals here, didn't use a lot of metal in their everyday tools. Things like iron are a composite material, so they weren't making iron. There was access in Ontario to copper near the surface, but copper is a very soft metal, so it doesn't make very useful tools such as axes. So our axes are all made out of stone at this point in time, and they are used for chopping wood, for cleaning bark off of wood, all sorts of different things. They are attached to a stick originally, either this way, similar tool looks like this, and they are used for, as I said, chopping wood. Now, sometimes if you're chopping small pieces, these work fine, but often they would have lit the fire or lit the tree on fire, lit the large log or whatever they were chopping on fire in order to speed up that process. And we only find the stone portion. Archaeology is dependent on what survives in the ground. So artifacts do not survive if they are organic. Organic materials are things that were once living. So wood, fabrics, leathers, foods, all these sorts of things. Hi, Loanne from Sarnia. Loanne is one of my students from a long time ago. She's watching us today. But all of these organic materials, they will rot away very, very quickly. Southern Ontario, all of Canada, most of North America is very temperate, and artifacts rot very quickly. So we're left with the artifacts that are made out of materials that do not rot or will not rot very quickly. So we have a lot of stone, and we have a lot of pottery, which I'm going to talk about next. And we have bones and shells, which will eventually rot, but they do survive for about at least 1,000 years or so before that process begins. So we can find those from this time period. Earlier than that, if they're very, very old, we find fossils of some bones that are archaeological in nature, which means they have a connection to people, but mostly not in between. So our axes are missing the handles, and we need to interpret them, understanding that parts are missing. Yeah. So pottery. Pottery, I talked a little bit about yesterday in the kids video. about when we were making pinch pots. And pinch pots are a small version of a pot. They are, any smaller pot can be made in a pinch pot fashion. No pottery here in Southwestern Ontario was made on a wheel, or in Ontario in general was made on a wheel prior to Europeans. And you don't need a wheel. Making pottery with pinch pots, as well as a coil method, which is rolling the clay into long strips of clay that can be coiled on top of each other, can make very large and sturdy, solid pottery. The pottery is useful for archaeologists across the world and not just here, because clay, which is found in the soil, is very malleable. So you can form it into any shape that you want. You can decorate it any way you want. And so people have done this differently all across the world, and it changes over time. And we use those changes and put them into a series from oldest to youngest, and we can begin to find patterns of the patterns and the shapes and the sizes and all these different types of things that allow us to look at a piece of pottery and know at a glance, once we've learned what to look for, how old that pottery is, and even where it's from. Sometimes we find pottery on an archaeological site that we don't expect to find there, and that can indicate that people were trading with other groups of people, or different people were living a little bit closer together than we thought. There's various things that could show us. So I have a few different pieces of pottery here. They are all, of course, small pieces of pottery. They are broken, what's called sherds, not to be confused with shards. Shards are glass, sherds are broken pieces of pottery. So we have one here. This is from the neck of a pot. So it would sort of curve out this way and make a fairly large pot, and then the rim would be up here. And you can see the decoration, these lines that are put into it. That's part of the decoration. This pottery, as well as this one here, you can see the patterns there that we find on. This is a rim of a pot, much smaller than the first one I showed you. This one is quite different again. And these are all sort of the types that we would find here in the London region. And all of those are roughly 500, 600 years old. But we also find pottery in this area that is a little bit different. So we find things that look like this, things that might look like this. Ooh. And you can see those are very pattern, texture-based decorations compared to that. The difference. And these last two pieces are probably more in the 1,000-year-old range. So that puts them into the Archaic period, which is the academic name for about 3,000 to 1,500 years ago, roughly. So that's our pottery. Pottery here too, I should say, is from pit fire, or not pit fires. We're actually not sure if they were pit fires. We pit fire at the museum, which means we dig a hole. But they were definitely fired with just a regular fire as opposed to a kiln. So ceramics that are baked at a hotter temperature, which we're more familiar with things like we might have in our kitchen, or sort of Victorian ceramics and Egyptian or Roman pottery. Those are all kiln fired, which makes them just a bit stronger in their initial fire. They get hotter. But as you saw, Kim was in our maple video from Wednesday, was using a traditional Iroquoian style pot like these to boil the maple sap in the fire pit, surrounded by all the hot coals. We talked a lot about controlling the fire heat for that. So you're welcome to look at that video if you're interested in the maple syrup and you haven't seen it yet. Another item that is very commonly found here in, well, North America and throughout the world too, are projectile points. They are spear-sized, like this one here. They can be arrowheads sized, like this one here. They can be, well, this one's very large for a drill. This is one here is a replica that was made by one of the friends of the Museum of Ontario Archaeology, Darcy, who is a flint napper. So flint napper is the name of the craft of making these tools. They're always sharp. There's also things called scrapers, which are used for scraping the guts off the inside of the skin to make leather, and for basically cutting anything you need sharp. The flint tool or the chert tool is what you would have used. So these tools here, they are made out of a stone called chert. We call it chert. The European term for it is flint. So here both, and they are essentially the same type, the same stone. They are made by breaking off little pieces. So you break off little tiny pieces in a very controlled way, so you get this nice sharp edge, and that can be sharpened ongoing until it can't be sharpened anymore. So as long as you have enough stone there to sharpen, you can sharpen it. And they're generally attached, if they're a drill, if they're an arrowhead or a spear point, they were attached to a shaft made out of stone, or made out of stone, I'm sorry, made out of wood, made out of a stick, which would have rotted away. They were hafted, which is the term for tying them together to the shaft to the point, with either leather or sinew, so a replica sinew here, which comes from the tendons of animals. Deer have long tendons, so like your Achilles tendon, all the muscle attachment to the bones are tendons, and you sort of hammer those apart into their fibers, twist them together, and you make a very strong string, which is called sinew. Much like the pottery, these arrow points, spear points, projectile points in general, they change over time and over place. So the style of them, the shape of them, the size changes by fashion. So much like clothes change, much like cars change, they vary, and we can learn based on a whole lot of samples what those changes are over time, and then we can identify the date and an area by just looking at a single point. We can also look at the material. So I said they're all made out of chert, but chert doesn't look the same everywhere. It is a sedimentary stone, which means that it's layers of dirt long ago that were compressed into a very fine stone. So whatever color this dirt was, the chert is that color. So here in Ontario, we have a lot of what's called Onondaga chert, which comes from the Niagara region, and it's kind of this stuff here. It's very gray, very uniform color. There's another larger piece. This is a flake. This is a larger piece that's broken off of the spear points, arrowheads, when they're being made. And that in itself can be quite sharp too. But everywhere doesn't have the same colors. So I have a few examples here from other places. This one here comes from the southern US. I'm not sure exactly which part, but down in the south of the continent. And it's kind of this almost pinkish hue, white colored. And this is completely different. This is a piece of chert from Australia, so it has that red and yellow color that's quite vibrant. And both of those were courtesy of our friend Darcy as well. What else do I have to share with us? Is there any questions at all, anyone? No? Okay. Those are arrow points. Most often, or at least when I've done archaeology in Ontario, excavating, we mostly find the pieces that come off of the arrow heads or spear points. You don't find these nearly as often. So for every one of these, there's potentially thousands of these, depending on how much work went into them. We also have a shell. So a shell here is just a shell. It's a freshwater clam. The Lawson Site Archaeological Museum has a creek that two creeks that run behind it. Heather was standing down in the creek area yesterday on her video of the Medway Valley in the village. And you find these along that river today, or along that creek, that waterway today. And if you find these today sitting on the edge of the river or creek anywhere, they're probably not artifacts. They are modern discarded animal shells. So the animal that has lived in them has passed away and they've left the shell behind, and we find it today. It's not an archaeological artifact. It's not associated with people. If you pick it up and take it home, it can be an artifact of you in the future, but not of our past. However, when we find shells within the context of a village or of another archaeological site, then far away from the water source where they would have been found, we know that people were involved with them getting there. And so on an archaeological site like the Lawson site, which is a village of 1,500 to 2,000 people, we find shells within that context, within that village. And most often these are believed they would have been spoons. And so people would have collected them and used them as we would use spoons today. So they have that same shape. Our spoons probably have shells as their ancestor, just the same. If we have a hole in it, this is a modern replica that Kim, our volunteer, made for us. But if they have a hole in it, then not a spoon, but a bead for a necklace, or tying onto clothing for decoration. So just as we would today, I'm sure many people watching have seen or have owned shells in a sort of a necklace jewelry context. And that's our shells there. And the last thing I'm going to show us, actually no, I have two more. Our second last thing I'm going to show us is something that looks like this. So this is a artifact called a net weight or a net sinker, and it is a basic river stone that has been picked up and broken with another rock, probably something fairly similar to our grinding stones. So they're very simple. They don't take a lot of time to make, but they're very important. So these are notched out here so that you could tie the net, the fishing net, which is made of natural strings, around them, and then thrown into the lake or the river or the creek if it's big enough, and used to pull the fish out. Without the net weights, the net won't sink, and you're not going to catch any fish if the net is floating on the surface. So they're quite important in the net fishing activity. And if we find those down by the creek or by the river, we know they're an artifact because we know people knocked those notches out. The last item that I have in here are some animal bones. So we find animal bones on archaeological sites a lot. And they come in a variety of animals, or we find them in a variety of animals. Often on the Lawson site, we find a lot of deer, turtle, and fish, which represents what people were eating, what people were hunting or trapping or fishing for. And we can look at all of those different bones and get a real sense of the diet of everyone in the village. can also tell us a little bit about the climate and other things like that as well. So I have a antler here from a deer. See that little hole that's at the bottom of it? If you have a stick and there's a little pointy end on the stick, you carve it out and that goes in there, and that helps haft it onto a stick. So these were used to as blanking on the name, punches. So they would be used to punch holes in leather, furs, even birch bark for making things like longhouses, canoes, and things like that. So it's a strong pointy for punching holes. Slightly smaller is an awl, which is made out of bones. These are made out of long bones. Comparable bones on humans are our arm bones, leg bones, and our metacarpals, and our metatarsals, which are in our feet. And any of these can be used to make, particularly the smaller ones, can be used to make awls or sewing needles. They aren't necessarily containing a small hole for the string, although I believe sometimes we do that has been found, but most often they would have been just pointy, punch a hole, and then poke the string through to sew clothing together and all those types of things. This one here is probably made out of something like a wolf or a coyote, something like that. So a medium-sized animal. And then we also find things like beads that are made out of, these are the toe bones, or this is a phalange of a deer. And it's decorations carved into it as well. So this is quite an interesting one. But lots and lots of bones are found. In the context of a village, we often find them in the longhouses, but also in what's called a midden. How are you able to date these artifacts? I have a question. I talked about it a little bit. One of the ways we date artifacts is by dating the entire site. So the Lawson site, we can date it by looking at the artifacts as a whole. So we find things like pottery pieces, which we've identified as a specific date. It's a very complex sort of process of putting all the sites that have been found together and establishing patterns across much, much broader ranges of geography. And you can mix that with some scientific testing. You can mix it with a variety of different dating techniques to establish that this piece of pottery is within the range of about 500 or 600 years old. And if you find a site with this piece of pottery on it, then we can date that site to the same age as the pottery and all of the stuff that's with it. So in most cases, we're doing what's called relative dating, which is artifacts that are on the site. We can date them visually and loosely, so not specifically necessarily to a specific date, but to a century or a decade, depending on the time period that we're looking at. And Rhonda has posted, I'm assuming that's Rhonda. Actually, I'm not sure, I just assume that. One of my colleagues has posted a bit more information on the comments as to how we can date things. I am going to do a video next week on seriation, which is how we put those things in series and how we determine dates of those things that can then be used to date bigger sites. So I'll talk more about that then. Is there any more questions at all before I sign us off? I don't think so. So thank you everyone again, and we don't have a complete schedule yet for next week, but I will post that up on our social media as soon as that is available, hopefully later today or tomorrow. And thank you very much, and we'll see you again.